Amid the scorching twin suns of Nexus Prime, Major Dominic Dom Reed, a weary Terran operative, thought his shore leave would be a brief escape from the chaos of hunting pirates across the galaxy. But when a strange, mysterious container crashes into the streets of Port Valyrian, he opens it, only to find a terrified, lilac-skinned alien woman on the brink of death, bound in chains. Now, what began as a simple rescue quickly spirals into a deadly game of intergalactic politics, with mercenaries hunting them both and a galaxy's fate hanging in the balance. As Dom and the mysterious woman, Lysa, flee through the chaos of Port Valyrian, each step forward only seems to draw them deeper into a web of danger. The woman harbors secrets, powers that could alter the course of galactic history. Will Dom protect her from the ruthless Drelock enterprises? And will they discover the truth behind her abduction before it's too late? Hold tight, because their bond is just beginning, and it could either save the galaxy or tear it apart. The twin suns of Nexus Prime hung high in the sky, their fiery glare beating down on the sprawling marketplace of Port Valyrian. Heat waves rippled over the sandy streets, turning the air into a shimmering curtain that blurred the edges of everything. Major Dominic Dom Reed adjusted the straps of his tactical harness, feeling sweat trickle down his spine beneath his black combat suit. His heavy boots crunched through the grit with every step, a constant reminder that he was a long way from Earth. 6 months of hunting pirates in the colonial shipping lanes had left him bone-tired, and this shore leave was supposed to be a break. 3 days in, though, the local booze, some foul swill they dared call whiskey, hadn't done much to ease the ache. Still, he kept moving. That's what humans did. They pushed through. Port Valyrian was a mess of a place, a frontier town where the galaxy's rejects and dreamers collided. Aliens of every shape and size filled the streets. Tentacled merchants haggling over glowing trinkets, four-eyed scavengers picking through trash, and hulking brutes flexing claws for no reason at all. Voices buzzed in a dozen languages, none of them human, and the air stank of spice, oil, and something sour Dom couldn't place. He passed a stall where a 6-armed Jexian, its translucent skin glinting in the sun, waved a rusted fork at him. Authentic Earth relic, it hissed, its voice a wet rasp. Ancient human scepter, only 50 credits. Dom snorted, not breaking stride. Overpriced garbage, he muttered under his breath. The Jexian spat something rude as he walked away, but Dom didn't care. Humans were still rare out here, and that made him a target for stares, some curious, some edged with hostility. He ignored them all, his supply straps loaded with tools and weapons clinking softly against his thighs. Standard gear for a Terran operative in a sector like this. You never knew when trouble would find you, and trouble always found him. It started with a low hum, a hover cart tearing through the crowd faster than it had any right to. People jumped aside, shouting as its repulsors kicked up clouds of yellow dust that stung Dom's eyes. The driver was a spindly Vexian, its green skin mottled with nervous splotches and tinny twitching like it was running from something. Dom stepped to the side, arms crossed, watching the cart careen past. "Someone's in a hurry," he said to no one, his voice dry. That's when he saw the cargo, a stack of metal containers piled high on the cart's back, swaying dangerously. The straps holding them were frayed, barely hanging on. As the cart swerved around a corner, one of the containers, a sleek, cylindrical thing about 2 meters long, broke free. It hit the ground with a heavy thud, rolling a few times before coming to a stop in the middle of the street. Dust settled around it, and the marketplace went quiet for a split second, like everyone was holding their breath. A small crowd gathered, aliens whispering and pointing, but no one got close. Caution was a survival skill here, and Dom knew it better than most. He squinted at the container, his hand drifting to the sidearm strapped to his thigh. The thing was polished, almost too clean for this dirty place, and strange symbols were etched across its surface, sharp, angular lines that didn't match any language he'd seen. It looked expensive and dangerous. Then it moved, a faint jolt, barely noticeable, but enough to make Dom's pulse kick up a notch. He took a step closer, boots grinding sand into the stone. Another sound came from inside, a muffled thud, like something knocking against the metal. "What the hell?" he muttered, kneeling beside it. The container shifted again, more forcefully this time, and a scrape echoed from within. Something was alive in there, trapped and fighting to get out. His training screamed at him to back off. Unknown containers in alien markets were the kind of thing that got you killed, or worse. Explosives, bioweapons, smuggled predators. He'd seen all. But then the sound changed. It wasn't just random banging anymore. It was desperate, almost pleading, like a trapped animal clawing for freedom. Dom clenched his jaw, staring at the container. Every instinct told him to walk away, to let someone else deal with whatever mess this was. He'd done his time, paid his dues. But that sound, it hit something deep, a part of him that had seen too many people left behind, too many lives snuffed out, because no one cared enough to step in. Humanity wasn't perfect, but it didn't turn its back. Not when it mattered. "Ah, screw it," he growled, his fingers finding the locking mechanism. It was simple enough, a latch with a pressure seal. He pressed down, and with a soft hiss, the lid popped open, releasing a puff of stale, metallic air. He wasn't ready for what he saw. Two eyes stared up at him, huge, glowing, and deep violet, like the sky just before a storm breaks. They belonged to a humanoid woman, curled tight in the cramped space. Her skin was a faint lilac, shimmering softly under the harsh sunlight, and her hair spilled around her shoulders like white silk catching the wind. She wore a thin beige dress, worn and torn at the edges, that clung to her slender frame in a way that made Dom's breath catch for half a second before he shoved the thought aside. Black metal bands circled her wrists and ankles, connected by thin, pulsing lines of energy that flickered faintly. She looked fragile, but those eyes, they held a fire, a mix of fear and something sharper, something alive. Dom froze, his hands still outstretched. The crowd around them murmured, but it faded into a dull hum as their gazes locked. Her expression shifted, fear melting into a cautious flicker of hope, like she was testing him, waiting to see what he'd do. "Don't be afraid," he said, keeping his voice low and steady. He extended his hand slowly, palm up. "I won't hurt you." Her lips parted, and a string of words spilled out, soft, musical, like wind chimes caught in a breeze. He didn't understand a syllable, but the sound sent a shiver down his spine. She was trying to tell him something, but the language was alien, unreachable. He shook his head, gesturing with both hands to show he meant no harm. "I don't get it," he admitted, hoping she'd see the intent in his eyes. Before she could respond, a shadow fell over them, heavy and cold. "That's valuable property you're interfering with, human." The voice was rough, like gravel scraped across stone. Dom turned his head slowly, rising to his feet as three figures stepped into view. The leader was a Krell, a big, reptilian bastard with scarred hide and yellow eyes that gleamed with menace. His clawed hand rested on the grip of a disruptor pistol, casual but ready. Flanking him were a wiry Vexian, its green skin twitching nervously, and a hulking cyborg with a metal arm whirring softly as it flexed. The Krell grinned, showing jagged teeth. "Lyrian pleasure model," he said, nodding at the woman. "High-grade merchandise, specially engineered, worth more than you'll ever scrape together in a lifetime. Human." Dom's jaw tightened, his hand hovering near his own weapon. He glanced back at the woman. She'd pulled herself up slightly, still half in the container, her violet eyes wide with something between terror and defiance. Property? Merchandise? The words churned in his gut like bad whiskey. He'd seen trafficking before. Humans, aliens, didn't matter. It was the same ugly game, and he'd never stomached it. "This isn't property," he said, his voice low and hard. "This is a person." The Krell laughed, a harsh, grinding sound that set Dom's teeth on edge. "Person? That's a pleasure model. Human. Built to serve. You're out of your depth." He took a step forward, claws flexing. "Step aside. The boss wants his cargo back." Dom shifted his stance, planting himself firmly between the mercenaries and the woman. Her eyes met his again, and in them he saw it. Not just fear, Not just hope, but a silent plea. Trust me, they seemed to say. Stand with me. He didn't know her story, but he knew one thing. No one deserved to be a thing, a toy for some rich bastard's amusement. Tell your boss he should have tied his cargo down better, Dom said, his tone cold as steel. Seems like he lost it to me. The Krell's grin vanished, replaced by a snarl. Last chance, human. Walk away. Dom's hand settled on his sidearm, fingers steady. Not happening. The first shot cracked through the air like thunder, and the marketplace exploded into chaos. Dom dove forward, yanking the woman from the container as blaster fire lit up the street. Screams echoed, stalls toppled, and dust choked the air. He hit the ground rolling, pulling her with him, his arm instinctively shielding her as the fight began. Whatever she was, whoever she was, he just made her his problem, and he wasn't about to let these scum take her back. The marketplace dissolved into pandemonium as the first blaster shot scorched the air, missing Dom's head by inches. He hit the ground hard, his arm hooking around the lilac-skinned woman and pulling her free from the container in one swift motion. She stumbled, her bound ankles throwing off her balance, but she didn't fall. Her bare feet found the sandy street fast, and she moved with him, quick and light, like she'd been waiting for this chance. Move, Dom shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. Screams erupted around them, merchants diving behind stalls, shoppers scattering like startled birds. Dust choked the air, thick and yellow, as security alarms began their shrill wail in the distance. The wiry Vexian mercenary lunged, drawing a jagged blade, but Dom was faster. He pivoted, slamming his boot into the alien's knee with a wet crack. The Vexian crumpled, howling, clutching the shattered joint as green blood oozed between its fingers. Dom didn't stop to admire the damage. He grabbed the woman's arm, her skin warm and smooth under his grip, and hauled her toward the nearest alley. This way, he barked, shoving her ahead of him. She didn't resist, her white hair streaming behind her like a comet's tail as they ran. The narrow passage swallowed them, its walls lined with stacked bolts of colorful fabric, reds, blues, purples, that shimmered in the dim light. Dom kicked over a pile as they passed, sending the heavy rolls tumbling into the path behind them. A disruptor bolt sizzled through the air, close enough that he felt the heat graze his ear, and slammed into the wall where his head had been a second ago. The Krell was still on their tail, his gravelly roar echoing over the clatter of falling goods. "You're dead, human," the mercenary bellowed, firing again. The shot went wide, blasting a hole through a merchant's awning, but it was too close for comfort. Dom risked a glance back. The Krell was shoving through the mess of fabric, his reptilian bulk slowed, but not stopped, while the cyborg lumbered behind, its metal arm whirring as it aimed a wrist-mounted cannon. No sign of the Vexian, probably still crying over his leg. Good. 2 against 1 was better odds, but not by much. He turned forward, focusing on the woman. She was fast, but her steps faltered every few strides, the energy tethers between her ankle bands flickering with each move. They were holding her back, slowing her down when she needed speed most. "Hold still," Dom said, skidding to a stop behind a stack of crates. She froze, her violet eyes locking onto his with a trust that hit him harder than it should have. He dropped to one knee, pulling his combat knife from its sheath. The blade gleamed, sharp and steady in his hand, a tool he'd used more times than he cared to count. This might sting, he warned, though he wasn't sure she'd understand. Her gaze didn't waver, steady and bright, like she was daring him to prove himself. He slid the knife under the faint blue line of energy connecting her ankles, feeling a faint buzz against his fingers, and sliced upward. The tether snapped with a sharp crackle, dissolving into sparks that fizzled out in the air. She gasped, a small, surprised sound, and flexed her legs, testing the freedom. Her lips curved, just a hint of a smile, and she nodded once, gratitude shining in those stormlit eyes. "Go," Dom said, sheathing the knife and pushing her forward. She took off, her movements smoother now, almost graceful, like a dancer finding her rhythm. He followed close, his boots pounding the stone as they darted deeper into the alley. The sounds of pursuit grew louder, boots stomping, metal clanking, the Krell's curses bouncing off the walls. Dom's mind raced, mapping the maze of Port Valyrian from memory. The stellar waypoint, his temporary safe house, was across the market district, a trek through hostile territory with no clear path. They needed a plan, and fast. She stopped suddenly, her hand grabbing his wrist. Her touch was light but firm, sending a jolt up his arm that he didn't have time to process. She pointed to a narrow side passage branching off to the right, barely wide enough for one person. Her fingers tightened, urging him toward it, and she made a quick gesture with her free hand, 2 fingers pointing ahead, then a sweep outward. "You know a way out?" Dom asked, his voice low. He didn't expect her to answer, not in words he'd get, but she nodded sharply, her white hair catching the faint light filtering through the alley. Those violet eyes held his, fierce and certain, like she'd mapped this place in her head long before he'd opened that container. Dom hesitated just for a heartbeat. His training screamed at him, "Don't trust an unknown, don't follow blind." Alien marketplaces were traps waiting to spring, and she could be leading him anywhere. But then he looked at her, really looked. The way she stood, straight despite the exhaustion pulling at her, the way her gaze didn't flinch. There was something there, something he couldn't name, but felt deep in his gut. A pull like gravity tugging him toward her. "All right," he said, exhaling hard. "Lead on." She didn't waste a second. She slipped into the passage, her slender frame moving with a quiet grace that made his heavy steps feel clumsy by comparison. He followed, ducking low to fit, his shoulders brushing the rough walls. The air grew cooler here, the noise of the marketplace fading into a muffled hum. The passage opened onto a less crowded street. Repair shops with flickering signs, a few aliens tinkering with junk machinery, no one paying them much mind. Her bare feet patted silently on the stone, while his boots thudded loud enough to draw a glance or two. She didn't slow, weaving through the shadows like she'd done this 100 times. "We need somewhere safe," Dom muttered, scanning the street for threats. His eyes flicked to the rooftops, the corners, anywhere a sniper might hide. "I've got a room at the Stellar Waypoint, but it's across the district. Too far with them on us." She didn't respond, not with words, but her pace quickened, her head tilting like she was listening to something he couldn't hear. Then she grabbed his arm again, yanking him hard into a recessed doorway just as a trio of security drones buzzed overhead, their red lights sweeping the street. The space was tight, barely enough room for one, let alone two. Her body pressed against his, her chest rising and falling fast against his tactical vest. Her breath brushed his neck, warm and quick, carrying a faint scent, like jasmine blooming under starlight. It hit him like a punch, stirring something low and restless in his core. He froze, hyper-aware of her closeness. The thin fabric of her dress did little to hide the soft curve of her frame, and where her hips grazed his, a heat sparked that he couldn't ignore. His hands hovered, itching to steady her, to feel more, but he clenched them into fists instead. Not the time. Her violet eyes flicked up to his, wide and searching, and for a moment, the world shrank to just them. Her warmth, her scent, the electric hum between them. Something passed in that look, a question he didn't know how to answer. A disruptor blast shattered the moment, slamming into the wall beside them and spraying stone fragments across the street. "Found you, human!" The Krell's voice roared from the end of the alley, closer than Dom liked. He shoved her behind him, drawing his sidearm in one fluid motion. "Stay down," he growled, firing 3 quick shots into the shadows. The mercenaries ducked for cover, buying them a few precious seconds. He scanned the wall above. There a service ladder, rusted but intact, leading to the rooftops. "Up," he said, pointing. "I'll cover you." She nodded, her hands finding the rungs with a grace that shouldn't have surprised him by now. She climbed fast, her torn dress fluttering as she went, and Dom followed, his blaster spitting suppressing fire to keep the Krell pinned. The ladder groaned under his weight, but it held. They were out of the alley, out of the line of fire. For now, whatever came next, they'd face it together. The rooftops of Port Valyrian stretched out before them like a jagged, uneven sea, domes of tarnished metal glinting under the twin suns, antennae spiking into the sky, and patches of makeshift gardens wilting in the heat. Dom hauled himself over the ladder's top rung, his boots scraping the edge as he landed beside the lilac-skinned woman. She was already moving, her bare feet silent on the sun-scorched tiles, her torn beige dress fluttering as she leapt a narrow gap between buildings with a dancer's ease. Dom followed, less graceful but just as determined, his heavy gear clanking with each stride. Below, the Krell's guttural shouts faded into the marketplace's din, but the threat wasn't gone, just delayed. "Keep going," Dom called, his voice sharp over the hum of distant drones. She didn't look back, her white hair whipping behind her like a beacon as she navigated the chaotic rooftop landscape. She darted around a rusting ventilation unit, then vaulted over a low wall, her movements fluid despite the black band still clamped around her wrists. Dom marveled at her agility, a flicker of admiration cutting through the adrenaline pumping in his veins. Whatever she'd been through in that container, it hadn't broken her, not yet. They reached a wider rooftop, cluttered with crates and tangled wires, and she skidded to a stop behind a large, humming ventilation unit. Dom dropped beside her, pressing his back against the metal, its heat seeping through his combat suit. He checked his sidearm. 3 shots left in the clip. Not good. His breath came hard, chest heaving as he scanned their surroundings. The city sprawled below, a maze of dust and neon, but up here they had a moment to think, a moment to breathe. "We need to get those restraints off you," he said, nodding at the bands on her wrists. They gleamed darkly, absorbing the sunlight rather than reflecting it, and faint pulses of energy still flickered within them. She extended her arms without hesitation, her violet eyes meeting his with that same steady trust he'd seen in the alley. He set his blaster down within reach and pulled out his multi-tool, flipping it to a thin probe. "Hold steady," he muttered, leaning in close. Her skin was warm under his touch, smooth and faintly luminous, and he caught that scent again, jasmine and starlight, soft but insistent. It stirred something in him, a pull he shoved down hard. "Focus, damn it." He worked the probe into a tiny seam on one of the bands, feeling for a catch. "Biometric, probably," he said, half to himself. "Key to whoever locked you up. No easy way around that." Her expression faltered, a shadow crossing her face, and she touched her throat with her free hand, then mimed speaking, fingers fluttering like she was pulling words from the air. "You want to talk?" Dom asked, pausing. She nodded, emphatic, her eyes bright with urgency. He holstered the tool and activated his wrist computer, cycling through its translation protocols. "Try now," he said, watching the screen flicker as it searched for a match. She leaned closer, her breath brushing his cheek, and spoke. "Help me," she said, her voice halting but clear, a melody strained through the clumsy software. "Dangerous. They come." Each word carried a weight, like she was forcing them out against some invisible barrier. Dom's chest tightened. She wasn't just asking for rescue. She was warning him. "Who are you?" he pressed, keeping his tone even. "Why were you in that thing?" She hesitated, then said, "I am Lysa." The name flowed smoother, natural on her tongue, like it belonged to her in a way the other words didn't. "They take me for—" The translator stuttered, flashing an error, and her frustration flared, sharp and visible. She reached out suddenly, her slender fingers brushing his temple. Dom flinched at the contact. A cool electric jolt shot through him, sharp but not painful like diving into deep water. Then images hit. A world of silver trees under purple skies, their leaves shimmering like glass. Uniformed figures with cold eyes, labs filled with beings like her, lilac-skinned, bound and silent. The Krell, his scarred face grinning as he accepted a stack of credits from a shadowy figure, cloaked in black. The visions flooded Dom's mind, vivid and fast, carrying emotions he couldn't name. Fear, loss, a spark of defiance. When she pulled her hand back, he gasped, steadying himself against the vent. His head spun, the after images lingering like a dream he couldn't shake. "You're telepathic," he said, the words rough with awe. She nodded, her expression softening, apologetic, almost like she hadn't meant to overwhelm him. She pointed to the wristbands, then tapped her head, her meaning clear. The restraints dulled her power, kept her locked inside herself. "A refugee," Dom said, pieces clicking together. "They're trafficking you for it." Her eyes widened, relief washing over her, so strong he could almost feel it himself. She'd been understood, maybe for the first time since they'd taken her. It hit him hard, tightening his chest in a way he didn't expect. A shout from below snapped him out of it. Harsh, guttural, too close. Dom peered over the vent's edge. The Krell and the cyborg were climbing a nearby ladder, their weapons glinting in the sunlight. "Damn it," he muttered, grabbing his blaster. "They're persistent." He glanced at Lysa, her face set with determination despite the exhaustion tugging at her. "My room's not far," he said, pointing toward a tall building with a distinctive blue dome piercing the skyline. "The stellar waypoint. We can rest there, figure this out." She followed his gaze, then surprised him by placing a hand on his cheek. Her touch was tentative, warm against his stubble, and her violet eyes softened with something that looked like gratitude, maybe more. It sent a shiver through him, a quiet heat blooming where her fingers rested. He smirked, covering the reaction. "Don't thank me yet. We still got to get there alive." She didn't pull away, her hand lingering a moment longer before dropping, and the air between them felt charged, heavy with unspoken things. Dom shook it off, forcing his focus back to the fight. "Stay low," he said, nodding toward the next rooftop. "We move fast." She took off again, leaping a gap with that same effortless grace, and he followed, his boots slamming the tiles as he kept one eye on her and the other on the ladder behind them. The Krell's head crested the edge just as they reached cover. A stack of crates piled haphazardly against the dome. Dom fired twice, the shots cracking loud in the open air. One grazed the cyborg's metal shoulder, sparking harmlessly, but it bought them time. Lysa ducked behind the crates, her breathing quick but controlled, and pointed ahead, a winding path through the rooftops, leading toward the blue dome. "That's our shot," Dom said, reloading his last clip. 3 shots remaining. He met her eyes, finding a quiet strength there that steadied him. Together, she nodded, a faint smile tugging at her lips, and they ran, 2 shadows racing across the heights, hunted but unbroken, with the promise of sanctuary dangling just out of reach. The stellar waypoint loomed ahead, its blue dome cutting through the haze of Port Valyrian skyline like a beacon in the storm. Dom and Lysa dropped from the rooftops onto a lower ledge, their boots and bare feet hitting the metal with a soft clang that echoed in the narrow service alley below. The shouts of the Krell and the whir of the cyborg's arm had faded into the distance, swallowed by the city's chaos. But Dom knew better than to relax. They weren't safe yet, not by a long shot. He scanned the alley, empty, save for a few flickering signs and a pile of discarded crates, then motioned for Lysa to follow. "This way," he said, keeping his voice low. "We're going in quiet." She nodded, her white hair catching the last rays of the twin suns as they slipped through a rusted service entrance. The door creaked open, revealing a maintenance corridor that smelled of cleaning solvents and something sharp, like burnt alien spices. It wasn't much, but to Dom, it was a lifeline, a chance to get off the streets and out of sight. He guided Lysa inside, his hand brushing the small of her back to steer her through the tight space. Her torn dress shifted under his touch, the fabric thin enough that he felt the warmth of her skin beneath, soft and alive. His fingers lingered a beat too long, a spark flaring in his chest, but he pulled back fast, focusing on the path ahead. Not now. The corridor was dim, lit only by flickering strips of light embedded in the walls. Their footsteps echoed, his heavy and deliberate, hers silent and quick, as they moved toward a service lift at the far end. Dom punched in a code, and the doors slid open with a groan. "In," he said, stepping aside to let her pass. She slipped into the lift, her slender frame brushing against him in the cramped space, and he caught that scent again. Jasmine and starlight, faint but intoxicating. It hit him harder this time, stirring a restless heat he shoved down with a grunt. She sagged against the wall as the doors closed, her shoulders slumping, and Dom saw the exhaustion etched in her lilac face. The adrenaline that had carried her across the rooftops was fading fast, leaving her trembling slightly, her breath shallow. "You okay?" he asked, keeping his tone steady. She nodded, but it was weak, her violet eyes half-lidded as she fought to stay upright. He studied her in the lift's soft light. Her skin shimmered faintly, like it held a glow of its own, and subtle patterns danced beneath the surface, shifting like auroras. The beige dress clung to her, torn at the hem and shoulder, revealing glimpses of her slender form. Delicate yet strong, a contradiction that pulled at him. He forced his gaze back to her face, noting the way her white hair framed it like a halo. She looked fragile, but he'd seen her move, seen the fire in her. Whatever she wasn't just some damsel. The lift chimed, jolting him out of his thoughts, and the doors opened onto a quiet corridor. Dom checked both ways, clear, then let her out, his hand hovering near his blaster. "Almost there," he said, guiding her with a gentle nudge. They reached his room, a Spartan box tucked into the waypoint's upper floors. He pressed his palm to the biometric lock, and the door slid open with a soft hiss. "Home sweet temporary home," he muttered, ushering her inside. The space was basic: bed, kitchenette, a single chair, and a wide viewport showing the city's skyline now bathed in the amber glow of sunset. Military approved, no frills, but it was secure. That's what mattered. "Get comfortable," Dom said, locking the door behind them. He tapped his wrist computer, activating extra security protocols. A low hum filled the room as the system kicked in. "That should keep us safe for now. They won't track us here." Lysa moved to the viewport, her fingers tracing idle patterns on the transparent surface as she stared out at the alien cityscape. The dying light cast her in silhouette, her white hair glowing faintly, the curve of her body outlined softly against the glass. Dom caught himself staring, her grace, her quiet strength, and shook it off, turning to shed his tactical harness. He set his weapons on the table, within easy reach, and rolled his shoulders, feeling the weight of the day settle in. "Let's see about those restraints," he said, grabbing his multi-tool and crossing the room. She turned from the window, her violet eyes meeting his with a mix of curiosity and trust. She extended her wrists, the black metal bands gleaming darkly in the room's light. Dom knelt in front of her, close enough to feel the heat radiating from her, and examined the restraints. They were sleek, seamless, with microscopic circuits embedded in the surface, high-tech, military-grade stuff. "Whoever put these on you wasn't messing around," he muttered, flipping the multi-tool to a fine probe. He found a small access port, barely a pinprick, and glanced up at her. "This might hurt a bit. You ready?" She nodded, her gaze steady, and he went to work. The probe slid into the port, and he twisted carefully, feeling for the mechanism. She winced, a sharp intake of breath escaping her lips, but she didn't pull away. Her skin brushed his as he adjusted his grip, warm and smooth against his calloused fingers, and a jolt ran through him. Electric, unexpected. He gritted his teeth, focusing on the task. After a tense minute, the first band clicked open with a soft thud, falling to the floor. The second followed, and the air around her seemed to shimmer, a faint ripple of energy washing over them both. Dom felt it, a gentle pressure against his mind, like standing at the edge of an ocean with the tide tugging at his feet. He stumbled back a step, catching himself on the chair. "Whoa," he breathed, staring at her. She flexed her wrists, her eyes widening as if she was waking up, and then her voice hit him, not through his ears, but inside his head. "Thank you," she said, clear and melodic, like a song carried on the wind. No translator, no tech, just her, speaking directly to him. He blinked, a grin tugging at his lips despite the shock. "You're welcome," he said aloud, still reeling. "That's Quite a talent you've got there. Her smile bloomed, transforming her face from striking to breathtaking. It is good to be heard properly again, she said, her mental voice rich with relief. My people, the Lyrians, communicate through thought-sharing. She stepped closer, her bare feet silent on the floor, and the air between them felt alive, charged with something new. Dom straightened, meeting her gaze. So that's why they had you locked up, he said, piecing it together. Because of this? Sadness clouded her expression, dimming her glow. Partially, she replied, her voice in his mind carrying a weight of memory. My kind are rare in this sector. Some value us as companions, advisors. Others fear what we might learn from their unguarded thoughts. She paused, then added, they saw me as merchandise, a luxury item for those wealthy enough to afford a personal telepath. The words twisted in Dom's gut, a familiar anger rising. He'd seen exploitation before, too much of it, but this felt different, more personal. You're not merchandise anymore, he said firmly, his voice low and sure. You're under my protection now. She tilted her head, studying him with those violet eyes, like she was seeing past his words into something deeper. You are unusual for a human, she said, her mental tone curious, almost playful. Most of your kind I've met were wary of telepathic contact. Dom shrugged, settling into the room's single chair. I've seen enough of the galaxy to know differences aren't something to fear. Take some getting used to, though. Her laugh echoed in his mind, soft and bright, like wind chimes in a breeze. I'm not in your head, as you might think, she said. I touch only the surface thoughts you project. To go deeper would require permission and intimacy. The word hung there, warm and heavy, sending a flicker of heat through him. He met her gaze, and for a moment, the room felt smaller, the space between them alive with possibility. The word intimacy lingered in the air, its echo in Dom's mind carrying a warmth that made his pulse quicken. Lysa stood before him, her lilac skin catching the soft light of the room, her violet eyes locked on his with an intensity that felt both foreign and familiar. The silence stretched, heavy with unspoken questions, and Dom shifted in the chair, trying to shake the feeling that she could see right through him. That's a hell of a way to say hello, he said, his voice rougher than he meant it to be, a half-smirk tugging at his lips to cover the heat creeping up his neck. Her laughter rippled through his thoughts again, light and musical, easing the tension in his shoulders. It is not my intent to unsettle you, she said, her mental voice a gentle caress. Among my people, such connections are natural. Openness is our way. She moved closer, her bare feet silent on the floor, and knelt in front of him, her hands resting lightly on his knees. The contact was soft, almost tentative, but it sent a jolt through him, her warmth seeping through his combat suit, her fingers brushing the fabric over his thighs. He froze, hyper-aware of her closeness, the way her torn dress draped over her curves, hinting at the slender strength beneath. That jasmine starlight scent wrapped around him again, pulling at something deep and restless. You saved me, she said, her voice layering, softly aloud and richer in his mind, a dual harmony that made his breath catch. Among Lyrians, such a debt creates a bond. Her hands tightened slightly, her touch firming against him, and Dom felt a spark flare where her fingers pressed. He leaned forward, drawn in despite himself, his hands hovering near hers, itching to close the distance. What kind of bond? He asked, his tone low, curious, edged with something he couldn't name. She didn't answer with words. Instead, she raised her hands, her palms hovering near his temples. May I? She asked, her mental voice a whisper, seeking permission. He nodded, barely breathing, and her fingers settled against his skin, warm, feather-light, igniting a current that raced through him. The room faded, and images flooded his mind, vivid and overwhelming. A world of silver trees swaying under purple skies, their leaves chiming in the wind. The weight of her capture, dark labs, cold restraints, the despair of confinement. Then the moment he'd opened the container, her fear giving way to a rush of relief, a flicker of hope tied to his face, his voice. Beneath it all ran a thread of fascination. With him, with humans, their unpredictable mix of chaos and kindness. When she pulled back, Dom gasped, the air rushing back into his lungs like he'd been underwater. His hands gripped the chair's arms, steadying himself as the aftershocks of her memories pulsed through him. "That's intense," he managed, his voice hoarse, his eyes locked on hers. She smiled, rising to her feet with a fluid grace that made his chest tighten. "It is only the beginning of what we could share," she said, her mental tone rich with promise, layered with undertones that sent a shiver down his spine. She stood over him now, her silhouette framed by the viewport's amber glow, and the space between them crackled with something alive, something neither of them could ignore. Dom pushed himself up, closing the gap until they were inches apart. "You're full of surprises," he said, his smirk returning. Though his heart pounded hard enough, he was sure she could feel it through their new connection. Her eyes flickered, shifting shades like an aurora, and her hand brushed his chest. Light, fleeting, but enough to make his breath hitch. "As are you," she replied, her voice and his mind teasing warm. "Your thoughts burn brightly," Dominic agreed. Unrestrained, honest. Her fingers lingered, tracing the edge of his vest, and the heat of her touch spread, tugging at his control. Before he could respond, his wrist computer chimed, sharp, insistent, cutting through the haze. He stepped back, cursing under his breath, and checked the screen. 0300 hours. He'd drifted into a light doze earlier, letting Lysa take the bed while he kept watch from the chair. Soldier's habit, never fully at ease. The message glowed in stark text from Commander Harlow. "Bad news. Your rescue ops stirred a hornet's nest. That merchandise belongs to Drelock Enterprises. 50,000 credit bounty on her return. Every merc and hunter in the quadrant's coming. Get off-world. Docking Bay 17, 0600. Don't be late." Dom swore, loud and sharp, the sound bouncing off the walls. Drelock Enterprises, arms dealers with fingers in every dirty deal this side of the galaxy. Ruthless, rich, and connected. He'd tangled with their kind before, but this was bigger. Trouble. Lysa's voice floated into his mind, gentle but clear. He looked up to find her watching him from the bed, her white hair spilling over the pillow like a waterfall of light. The thin dress clung to her as she sat up, outlining her form in a way that made his mouth go dry for a split second before he forced his focus back. "Yeah," he said, forwarding the message to her via his wrist interface. "Powerful people want you back. We need to move." She slid off the bed, her movements slow but deliberate, and crossed to him, her bare feet whispering against the floor. She read the text, her expression darkening as the name hit her. "Drelock," she whispered aloud, the word heavy with loathing, her mental voice echoing it with a cold edge. "I should have known. You know them?" Dom asked, gathering his gear, blaster, knife, harness, his hands moving on autopilot. She stopped in front of him, close enough that he could feel her warmth again, and her eyes met his, solemn and deep. "There's something I must show you," she said, her mental tone shifting, heavier now. "Something I couldn't risk sharing until I was certain of you." Before he could ask, her hands rose again, pressing against his temples. This time, the connection was deeper, more intimate, like stepping into her soul. He saw her, Lysa Ventil, High Counselor of the Lyrian Conclave, standing tall in formal robes, addressing a council of her people. He felt her authority, her responsibility, the weight of negotiating peace for a species caught in a galaxy that wanted to exploit them. Then the betrayal. A diplomatic ship, a drugged drink, a hasty abduction. Soldiers with Drelock insignia dragging her away, her mind dulled by restraints. When a vision broke, Dom staggered back, his breath ragged, the implications crashing over him like a wave. "Your royalty," he said, struggling to process it. She shook her head slightly, correcting him. "Not royalty as humans understand it. But yes, I hold authority. The Conclave negotiates our place in the Galactic Alliance. Drelock stands to lose billions in weapons contracts if our treaty succeeds. Her voice hardened both aloud and within. They've been harvesting telepathic compound from my people for years, neural weapons. My disappearance was meant to sabotage the talks. Dom ran a hand through his hair, the stakes suddenly interstellar. We need to get you back to your people, he said, his resolve locking into place like a loaded clip. Expose this. Finish what you started. She stepped closer, her eyes searching his, a flicker of wonder breaking through her determination. Why are you helping me, Dominic Reed? She asked, her mental voice soft, intimate. You've placed yourself in danger for someone you barely know. The question caught him off guard, and for a moment, he didn't have an answer, just a feeling, raw and unformed, tugging at him. It's the right thing, he said finally, simple and true. Humans don't always have the best rep out here, but we don't stand by while people get screwed over. Her lips curved, a small, knowing smile, and her hand brushed his arm, sending a ripple of warmth through him. Your thoughts betray more, she teased, her tone light but piercing. He felt the flush rise again. She'd sensed it, the pull he couldn't hide. And damn if he didn't mind. The question hung between them. Why are you helping me? And Dom's simple answer felt heavier now, echoing in the quiet room as Lysa's teasing smile lingered. Her touch still burned on his arm, a faint warmth that refused to fade, and her violet eyes held his with a mix of curiosity and something deeper, something that made his pulse thud harder than he'd admit. He opened his mouth to say more, maybe deflect with a joke, but the moment shattered as his wrist computer flared red, an urgent alert slicing through the stillness. Perimeter breach, Dom muttered, snapping to attention. He tapped the screen, pulling up the security feed. Someone, or something, was overriding the room's lock, the system's defenses buckling under a brute force hack. They found us. His voice was steel, all traces of softness gone as he grabbed his blaster from the table. He tossed a spare one to Lysa, its grip worn but solid. Know how to use this. She caught it midair, her movements sharp and precise, and adjusted the settings with a flick of her fingers. High counselors are trained in self-defense, she said, her tone calm but edged with resolve. Her mental voice brushed his mind, steady and clear. Though I prefer not to kill unless necessary. Dom nodded, impressed despite the ticking clock. Set it to stun, then. We're not here to rack up bodies. Just get out. The door's lock buzzed, a harsh, grating sound, and Dom positioned himself beside it, weapon raised. Lysa moved to his flank, her stance mirroring his, a quiet confidence radiating from her. The first mercenary burst through, Vexian, antennae twitching, blaster drawn, but he didn't get a shot off. Dom fired, a stun bolt catching the alien square in the chest. It crumpled, limbs twitching as it hit the floor. A second figure followed, a human this time, scarred and wild-eyed, but Lysa's aim was flawless. Her shot hummed through the air, dropping him before he could blink. Not bad for a diplomat, Dom said, a grin flashing across his face. Many skills, she replied aloud, a faint smirk tugging at her lips. Her mental voice added a playful lilt. You're not the only one who can surprise. Before he could retort, 3 more mercenaries crowded the doorway, plasma bolts sizzling overhead. Dom yanked Lysa down behind the overturned bed, the frame shuddering as shots scorched the wall. We need another way out, he growled, peering over the edge. The viewport was sealed, reinforced, no chance of breaking through without heavy gear they didn't have. Lysa's eyes narrowed, her focus sharpening. I may have a solution, she said, her voice steady despite the chaos. But it will take energy more than I have alone. Dom glanced at her, catching the strain in her expression. What's the plan? She closed her eyes, and the air around her began to hum, a faint violet shimmer dancing at her fingertips. Cover your eyes, she warned, her mental tone tight with effort. He obeyed, just as a pulse of light erupted from her hands. Not a shield this time, but a raw, concussive wave. It slammed into the mercenaries, hurling them back into the corridor like broken dolls. They hit the walls and slumped, alive but out cold. The effort dropped Lysa to her knees, her gasp sharp and ragged. Dom caught her before she fell, his arm looping around her waist, pulling her close. Her body pressed against his, trembling from the exertion, and he felt the rapid thud of her heart through the thin fabric at her side. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low, urgent. She nodded weakly, leaning into him for support. "Psionic discharge," she panted, her mental voice fainter now. "A last resort. It drains me." "Got it," Dom said, helping her to her feet. Her weight was light in his arms, but the closeness, her warmth, the way she fit against him, sent a flicker of distraction through him. He shook it off. "Can you walk?" She straightened, pulling away slightly, though her hand lingered on his shoulder for balance. "I need a moment," she said, taking a deep breath. "It draws from life, energy. I'll recover, but not fast enough." Her eyes met his, and beneath the exhaustion, there was a hint, an unspoken suggestion that made his gut tighten. "We've got maybe 2 minutes before more show up," Dom said, glancing at the doorway. The security sensors were likely screaming after that display, drawing every hired gun in the district. That blast bought us time, not safety. He scanned the room, then nodded toward the emergency stairwell across the hall. "We hit the Undercity. Maintenance tunnels lead to the spaceport. It's our best shot." Lysa nodded, her resolve hardening, and they moved, slipping out of the room as the distant wail of alarms grew louder. The stairwell was a narrow spiral, its metal steps rattling under Dom's weight. Lysa followed close, her steps faltering on the last flight as her strength wavered. She stumbled, a small sound escaping her, and Dom spun, catching her arm before she hit the railing. "I've got you," he said, his grip firm but gentle. Her eyes flicked up to his, gratitude mingling with frustration. "I'm slowing you down," she said, her mental voice tinged with self-reproach. "Not a chance," Dom replied, his tone gruff but sure. Without hesitation, he scooped her up, one arm under her knees, the other cradling her back. She felt lighter than he'd expected, her form molding to his hold like she belonged there. Her arms looped around his neck, her face brushing close to his, and her breath grazed his ear, warm, unsteady, stirring a heat he couldn't ignore. "This isn't dignified for a high counselor," she murmured aloud, though he caught the faint curve of a smile against his skin. "Call it diplomatic transport," he quipped, pushing through the service door at the stairwell's base. The Undercity sprawled before them, a shadowed labyrinth of neon-lit streets and forgotten corridors, the air thick with a mingled sense of exotic cooking and mechanical grease. Dom adjusted his grip, her thighs pressing against his arm, her closeness a quiet distraction he fought to keep at bay. "Your thoughts are loud," she said, her mental voice stronger now, teasing despite her fatigue. "Worried about them, and me. Humans aren't great at hiding that stuff," he admitted, his jaw tightening as he scanned the alley ahead. A group of Drelock security forces marched past the main thoroughfare, their armor clanking, forcing Dom to duck into a narrower passage. The space was tight, barely wide enough for him to carry her, and he pressed her against the wall to avoid detection. Her body flattened against his, her chest rising fast against his vest, and her fingers brushed his collar, leaving trails of warmth that made his breath catch. "Your heart's racing," she noted, her mental tone playful, a spark of mischief cutting through the danger. "Occupational hazard," he said dryly, though his voice came out rougher than he meant. "Getting shot, it does that." Her laugh echoed in his mind, soft and fleeting. "Is that all?" she teased, her fingers lingering at his neck, tracing the edge of his jaw. The touch was light, but it burned, pulling at something primal he couldn't afford to indulge. Not yet. "You know it's not," he muttered, meeting her gaze for a split second before distant shouts yanked his focus back. "We need to keep moving," Lysa said, her tone shifting to urgency as she steadied herself. Dom set her down, relieved to see her stand firm, though her hand stayed on his arm for balance. "Tunnels are close," he said, pointing to a rusted access hatch half hidden behind a stack of cargo containers. He punched in his military override code, and the hatch groaned open, revealing a damp, dimly lit passage stretching into the dark. "Not exactly luxury travel," he said, stepping aside to let her go first. "I've survived worse lately," she replied, slipping inside with a glance back at him, her eyes gleaming with a mix of trust and defiance. Dom followed, the hatch clanging shut behind them, sealing them to shadows as the sounds of pursuit faded, for now. The maintenance tunnel swallowed them whole, its damp walls glistening under the faint glow of emergency lights spaced too far apart. The air was cool and heavy, thick with the tang of rust and stale water, and each step echoed in the tight space, Dom's measured strides blending with the soft patter of Lysa's feet. The hatch had sealed behind them, muffling the Undercity's chaos, but the reprieve felt fragile, like a thread stretched too thin. Dom kept his blaster ready, his eyes scanning the shadows ahead, every instinct honed from years in the field screaming that they weren't out of danger yet. Lysa moved beside him, her pace steady now, though he could sense the effort it took. The psionic burst back in the room had drained her, and while she'd regained some strength, her breathing stayed quick, a quiet rhythm he couldn't ignore. "Spaceport's close," he said, breaking the silence to keep them focused. He checked his wrist computer, the screen casting a faint blue glow across his face. "From a junction ahead, it's a straight shot to docking Base 17. We just need to—" She stopped abruptly, her hand catching his arm, fingers pressing firm against his sleeve. The suddenness jolted him, and he turned, meeting her gaze. Her violet eyes were sharp, urgent, cutting through the tunnel's gloom. "Dom, wait," she said, her voice soft but laced with weight. "There's something you should know before we go further." Her mental tone slipped into his mind, intimate and solemn, wrapping around his thoughts like a tether. He frowned, lowering his weapon slightly. "What kind of something?" She hesitated, her hand sliding down his arm to rest at his wrist, her touch a steady anchor. "If we succeed, when we succeed, in reaching my people, there will be complications," she said. Her words carried a vulnerability he hadn't heard before, and it sharpened his focus. "Complications?" he asked, his voice low, wary. She stepped closer, her presence filling the narrow space, and the air between them thickened with unspoken stakes. "The bond forming between us," she said, her mental voice weaving through his thoughts, warm and close. "Among Lyrians, such connections are not casual. What we've begun, it cannot be undone easily, especially after—" She trailed off, her eyes flickering with something he couldn't quite read. "After what?" he pressed, though a part of him already guessed, the memory of her warmth against him in the alley flashing through his mind. "After full communion," she finished, her tone steadying, though a faint violet flush colored her cheeks. "A joining, not just of bodies but of minds and spirits. It would create a permanent link. You would carry a piece of me always, as I would carry you." The words hit him like a shockwave, staggering in their scope. He blinked, processing the weight of it. A telepathic bond, forever, with a woman he'd known for less than a day. "That's a hell of a commitment," he said, his voice rough, though even as he spoke, the words felt hollow. Something about her, her courage, her quiet defiance, had already sunk deeper than he'd expected. She smiled, small and knowing, catching the flicker of his thoughts through their growing connection. "Time is a poor measure of true bonds," Dominic agreed, she said, her mental voice softening. "But the choice must be yours, made with full understanding." Her hand tightened on his wrist, a silent plea for him to weigh it carefully. Before he could respond, the tunnel shook, a low, rumbling boom that sent dust raining from the ceiling. Dom steadied her as the ground trembled, his free hand gripping his blaster. What the hell was that? Another explosion followed, closer this time, the sound rolling through the passage like thunder. Chunks of debris crashed down behind them, kicking up clouds of grit that stung his eyes. "They're bombing the tunnels," Dom said, checking his wrist display. The map flickered, showing sections collapsing systematically, herding them toward the spaceport. "It's a trap," Lysa said, her voice calm but firm, her mind brushing his with a shared realization. They know where we're going. The tunnel split ahead, 3 paths branching into the dark. Dom's screen showed their planned route half caved in, leaving 2 options, one veering deeper into the Undercity's maze, away from their goal, and another emerging near the spaceport perimeter, dangerously close to Drelock's forces. No good choices, he muttered, the tunnel shaking again as support beams groaned overhead. We can't stay here, Lysa said, stepping up beside him, her shoulder brushing his. I might have enough strength for one more burst, if it comes to that. He glanced at her, noting the faint strain in her posture, the way her hands clenched at her sides. Not an option, he said, firm but gentle. You're barely holding it together as it is. A louder crash echoed behind them, the tunnel buckling, and a wave of dust washed over them. Spaceport route, he decided, grabbing her hand. Stay close. Her fingers laced with his a quiet strength in the grip, and they sprinted down the right-hand path. The passage narrowed, forcing them to duck under dripping pipes and sidestep puddles that turned the floor slick. Lysa stumbled, her energy faltering, and Dom caught her before she fell, pulling her against his side. I'm fine, she said, though her mental voice wavered, frustration bleeding through. We go together or not at all, he replied, his arms steady around her waist, keeping her upright as they pushed forward. The tunnel ended at a maintenance hatch, its surface pitted with rust. Dom's scanner beeped, a dozen Drelock operatives patrolling beyond, a blockade locking the perimeter tight. They've got us boxed in, he said, his jaw tightening as he checked the time. 23 minutes to 0600, when Harlow's ship would leave with or without them. Another distant explosion rattled the walls, a reminder of the net closing in. Lysa leaned against the hatch, catching her breath, her hand pressed her chest. There's another way, she said, her voice low, hesitant. One I've avoided suggesting until now. Dom turned to her, catching the intensity in her gaze. What's that? She straightened, her eyes locking with his, a mix of resolve and vulnerability shimmering there. The communion we spoke of, she said, her mental tone threading through his mind, intimate and urgent. It's more than a bond. When Lycerians join with compatible beings, there's an exchange, an infusion of energy. It could restore me, maybe enough to shield us through their lines. His pulse spiked, the implications sinking in. You're talking about, yes, she cut in, her flush deepening, though her voice held steady. A physical union, but more, a melding of essence. It would forge the permanent link I mentioned, but it could amplify my abilities just for a while. She glanced around the tunnel, damp, flickering, far from romantic, and a faint laugh escaped her mind. Hardly ideal, I know, but necessity often overrides preference. Dom studied her, the absurdity of it clashing with the pull he felt, her strength, her trust, the way she looked at him like he was more than just a soldier. You don't do things halfway, do you? He said, a wry edge to his voice. She stepped closer, her hand finding his chest, resting there with a weight that made his breath catch. Lycerians don't undertake this lightly, she said, her mental voice a soft promise. It would be irrevocable. You'd know me as I know myself, and I'd know you. He didn't flinch, didn't pull away. Her touch anchored him, her presence a steady flame in the dark. I've never run from a fight, he said, his voice low, rough with something raw. Not starting now. Her eyes softened, a spark of wonder breaking through, and the tunnel seemed to fade, leaving just the two of them. 2 souls on the edge, with everything to lose and something extraordinary to gain. Dom's words hung in the tunnel's damp air. I've never run from a fight. And Lysa's eyes flared with a mix of awe and resolve, her hand still pressed to his chest. The faint hum of her touch vibrated through him, a quiet pulse that synced with the thudding in his ribs. The tunnel shook again, a distant explosion sending tremors through the walls, but it felt far away now, drowned by the gravity of her presence. She didn't pull back, her fingers curling slightly against him, and the air crackled with a tension that wasn't just about survival anymore. "Then we do this," she said, her voice a soft thread weaving through his mind, steady despite the chaos closing in. Together, her gaze held his, unflinching, and Dom felt the weight of her offer. Irrevocable, she'd said. A permanent bond, minds entwined across species, across stars. It was insane by any measure, but looking at her, feeling the quiet strength radiating from her, he couldn't imagine turning away. Not from her. Not from this. He nodded, a single sharp motion, and her lips parted in a faint, relieved breath. "Trust me," she whispered, stepping closer until the space between them vanished. Her hands slid up, framing his face, and the warmth of her palms sent a shiver racing down his spine. He mirrored her, his fingers finding her shoulders, tracing the delicate lines there before settling at her neck. The contact sparked something electric, a current that hummed beneath his skin, and when she leaned in, their lips met. Not tentative, but urgent, a collision of need and defiance against the encroaching dark. The kiss deepened fast, her breath mingling with his, sharp and hungry. Her fingers slipped beneath his vest, grazing the top muscle of his chest, igniting a fire that spread low and fast. He responded, his hands sliding down her back, finding the curve where her spine dipped, pulling her closer until their bodies pressed flush. The world narrowed. Explosions, tunnels, Drelock, all fading into a distant roar as sensation took over. Her touch was a map he hadn't known he needed, each point of contact a flare in the dark. "Open to me," she murmured against his mouth, her mental voice a velvet pull. Dom hesitated, instinct clenching at the edges of his mind, barriers he'd built over years of war, of solitude. But her presence coaxed them down, gentle yet insistent. He let go, and it was like a dam breaking. Her consciousness flowed into his, liquid light spilling through cracks he hadn't known were there. He gasped, the sensation foreign yet right, like a melody he'd forgotten he knew. In return, he felt himself spill in her, memories of Earth's blue skies, the weight of his rifle, the quiet ache of loss, and the fierce spark of meeting her. The tunnel's gloom vanished as their minds merged. He saw her world again, silver forests chiming in the wind, her role as a leader, the cold betrayal of her capture. But now it was deeper, sharper, laced with her emotions. Fear, yes, but also a growing wonder at him, at humanity's raw, untamed heart. Their physical closeness intensified, hands roaming with a desperate edge. His fingers traced the line of her ribs, feeling the quick rise and fall of her breath, while hers found the pulse at his throat, pressing there as if to claim it. Each touch echoed in their shared bond, doubling the heat, building a storm neither could contain. Clothing became an afterthought, shed in the flickering shadows with an urgency born of necessity and desire. Her skin glowed faintly, a violet sheen that pulsed with her energy, and when they joined, it wasn't just flesh meeting flesh, it was a collision of essence. A surge erupted between them, raw and elemental, like a star igniting in the void. Light flared from her, enveloping them in a shimmering cocoon, and Dom felt power flood through him, wild, unbound, before it poured into her. She arched against him, a sound escaping her that he felt in his bones, and the energy shifted, her strength renewing as their bond locked into place. When it ended, they broke apart, breathless, the air charged with the aftermath. Dom steadied himself against the wall, his chest heaving, while Lysa stood radiant, her eyes blazing with a vitality that hadn't been there before. "Now we are truly bonded," she said, her voice a dual echo, soft aloud, resonant in his mind. He touched her face, marveling at the warmth that lingered, and felt her presence inside him. A steady glow, a piece of her he'd carry always. "I can feel you," he said, or roughening his words. "Even without touching you." She smiled, a quiet triumph in it. "It will grow stronger with time." She stepped back, energy coiling around her like a second skin, and Dom checked his chronometer as he pulled his gear back into place. 15 minutes to 0600. "It's going to be tight," he said, holstering his blaster. Lysa's expression turned resolute, her hands flexing as violet sparks danced at her fingertips. "Then we don't waste this gift," she said. "Stay close. My shield will hold, but only near me." He nodded, and she pressed her palms to the hatch. With a burst of force, it flew outward, and they emerged into chaos. The spaceport tarmac stretched ahead, a battlefield of blaster fire and shouting Drelock operatives. Lysa's shield flared to life, a shimmering dome that deflected the first volley of shots, rippling with each impact. They sprinted, Dom matching her stride, his weapon drawn but unneeded as her power held firm. "Docking Bay 17, he yelled, pointing to a hangar in the distance, its silhouette stark against the dawn sky. A heavy gunner stepped into their path, a rotary plasma cannon spinning up with a menacing whine. "Down!" Dom shouted, tackling Lysa as a torrent of energy bolts tore through the air. The shield buckled under the barrage, and through their bond, he felt a searing sting, like fire licking at her edges. She gasped, clutching his arm, and he rolled them behind a cargo crate, his shoulder protesting from the impact. "Can't take another like that," she said, her voice tight, though her eyes burned with defiance. He popped up, sighting the gunner, and fired 3 precise shots, 2 to the chest, 1 to the head. The cannon clattered silent as the mercenary fell, its discharge sizzling into the ground. "Not bad," Lysa said, her mental tone laced with admiration despite the strain. "Save it for the ship," Dom grunted, pulling her up. They ran again, the shield flickering but holding until a sniper's bolt punched through, grazing his shoulder. Blood welled, hot and sharp, and he stumbled, gritting his teeth against the pain. "Dom!" Lysa's cry rang out, both aloud and within, her hands catching him before he fell. Through their bond, he felt her panic mirror his own, a shared ache that blurred his vision. "Keep going," he rasped, clutching the wound. "I'll manage." But she shook her head, fierce now, and pulled him behind a stack of fuel drums. "No," she said, her voice steel. "I won't lose you." Her hands pressed over the injury, energy flowing from her in a rush, cool at first, then warm, knitting flesh with a tingling rush. "Sharing essence," she said, her face taut with focus, deeper than before. He felt the drain on her, a pull that echoed in his own chest, but the wound closed, leaving only a dull throb. "You're pushing too hard," he said, gripping her wrist as she swayed. "Calculated risk," she replied, a tight smile breaking through. "I need you whole." 7 minutes remained, and they bolted from cover, the path to the hangar clear for a fleeting moment. Too clear. "Trap," Dom muttered, his gut twisting, and Lysa's agreement hummed through their link. A slow, mocking clap echoed from the hangar's shadows as they approached. A tall figure stepped forward, human, silver-haired, clad in a crisp Drelock uniform. "Director Mercer," Lysa hissed, recognition laced with venom. "High Counselor and her pet," he said, his voice smooth and cold, a predator's grin spreading across his face. "Quite the show." Dom's grip tightened on his blaster. "You ordered this," he said, not a question. Mercer shrugged, casual as death. "Business. Your treaty would have cost us billions. Nothing personal. Where's Harlow?" Dom demanded, rage simmering. Mercer's smile widened. "Reassigned permanently." Lysa's calming presence brushed his mind. "He's baiting you." "Focus dot," and Dom exhaled, steadying himself. "Sign away your treaty," Mercer said, gesturing to a sleek transport behind him, "and you're free. Refuse, and neither of you leave alive." Lysa stepped forward, regal despite everything. "You underestimate us," she said, her voice ringing clear. Before Mercer could react, she unleashed her energy, not a shield, but a lance of violet light that speared the hangar's control panel. Alarms blared, and foam sprayed from the ceiling, thick and blinding. "Run!" she shouted, her mind urging Dom forward. He sprinted for the ship, sliding into the pilot's seat as systems hummed to life. "Lysa!" he called through their bond, fear spiking when silence answered. The ramp began to close, and then she was there, leaping aboard, rolling into the hold as Mercer's furious shout cut through the haze. Blaster fire peppered the hull as Dom hit the controls, the transport lurching skyward. Lysa reached the cockpit, steadying herself against his chair, and he punched the throttle, breaking atmosphere in a streak of light. Hyperspace swallowed them, and only then did he relax, turning to her. Her eyes shone, fierce and alive. "We made it," he said, still half disbelieving. "Was there doubt?" she teased, her hand finding his. "Not with you," he murmured, pulling her close, their bond a steady hum as the stars blurred beyond. The transport's cockpit hummed softly as hyperspace streaked past in ribbons of blue and white, a cosmic blur that bathed Dom and Lysa in its glow. Dom slumped back in the pilot's seat, adrenaline bleeding out of him now that the roar of engines and blaster fire had faded. His shoulder ached where the sniper's bolt had grazed him, a dull reminder of how close they'd cut it. But Lysa's touch, her energy stitching him back together, still lingered like a quiet pulse beneath his skin. He exhaled hard, running a hand over his face, and glanced at her. She stood beside him, one hand braced on the console, her silhouette sharp against the viewport. The violet shimmer that had flared during their escape had settled into a faint radiance, illuminating her features with an otherworldly grace. Her presence filled the small space, not just physically, but through their bond, a steady warmth threading through his thoughts. "We made it," he said, the words rough with relief, almost a question to himself. She turned, her lips curving into a faint, teasing smile. "Was there doubt?" she replied, her voice a soft echo in his mind as much as his ears. "Not with you," he murmured, reaching for her hand. Her fingers laced with his, cool and sure, and he pulled her closer until she settled against the armrest, her knee brushing his thigh. The contact sent a spark through him, familiar now, but no less potent, a reminder of the communion that had forged them together. "With humanity's finest," she added, her mental tone playful, nudging at the pride he hadn't voiced. He chuckled, low and genuine, the sound easing the last knot of tension in his chest. Something like that. For a moment, they stayed there, the ship's hum wrapping around them like a shield. Through their link, he felt her, her exhaustion tempered by triumph, her gratitude laced with a quiet wonder at him. It was a mirror to his own thoughts, a feedback loop that made the silence feel alive. He squeezed her hand, marveling at how natural it felt, how a stranger from a capsule had become this, an anchor, a partner, a piece of him he couldn't imagine losing. Lysa shifted, leaning forward to study the navigation panel. "We're on course for the Valyrian relay station," she said, her tone shifting to focus. "2 cycles, perhaps 12 of your hours, until we reach it." Her fingers danced over the controls, pulling up a star chart that glowed in soft hues of purple and gold. "From there, I can signal my people, bring evidence against Drelock." She glanced at him, her eyes searching. "They'll owe you a debt," Dominic read. "More than I can repay alone." He shook his head, leaning back. "Don't need a medal for doing what's right. Just want to see Mercer and his goons squirm when this blows up in their faces." Her smile widened, a flicker of amusement crossing their bond. "You enjoy the chaos of justice," she said, her mental voice warm with insight. "It's very human." He grinned, unapologetic. "Guilty as charged." She straightened, stepping away to pace the cockpit's narrow width, her movements fluid despite the fatigue he sensed beneath her surface. "What comes after?" she asked, pausing to face him. "When the treaty is secured, when Drelock falls. What then?" The question carried weight, a thread of uncertainty weaving through their link. Dom sat up, resting his elbows on his knees, and met her gaze. "Hadn't thought that far," he admitted. "Been running on instinct since that damn capsule rolled into my life." Her laugh echoed in his mind, soft and bright. "Instinct has served us well," she said, crossing back to him. She perched on the console's edge, close enough that her scent, jasmine and starlight, a signature he'd never tire of, drifted over him. "But now we have choices." Her hand found his shoulder, resting there with a quiet intimacy that sent a ripple through him. Two paths, one bond, she added, her voice layering with meaning. He tilted his head, catching the shift in her tone. You've got something in mind, he said, half question, half statement. She nodded, her fingers tracing a slow line along his collarbone, a touch that stirred a low heat despite the calm. The Conclave will need me to finish the treaty, she said, her mental voice threading through his thoughts like a melody. Expose Drelock, secure peace, it's my duty. But after, she paused, her eyes softening. There's us. Us, he echoed, the word settling in his chest like a spark finding dry tinder. He reached up, covering her hand with his, feeling the pulse beneath her skin sync with his own. What does that look like? He asked, his voice rougher now, edged with curiosity and something deeper. She leaned in, her face inches from his, and the air thickened, charged with a pull that had grown since the tunnel. Whatever we choose, she said, her breath brushing his jaw, warm and deliberate. A soldier and a counselor, a human and a Lycerian, bound across stars. Her fingers slipped to his neck, pressing lightly against the pulse there, and a sensation rippled through their bond, doubling its intensity. He felt her intent, open, unguarded, a quiet invitation, and his hand slid to her waist, anchoring her as he stood, closing the gap until their foreheads touched. The kiss came slower this time, deliberate, a contrast to the urgency of before. Her lips moved against his with a tenderness that belied the fire beneath, and he responded, deepening it as his hands found the small of her back, pulling her into him. Through their link, he felt her calm unraveling into a tide of longing, mirroring his own. It wasn't the desperate rush of survival now, but a claiming, a promise shaped by choice. Her hands roamed his shoulders, nails grazing lightly, igniting trails of warmth that sank into him. And he pressed her against the console, the edge digging into her hips as the moment stretched. When they parted, breathless, her eyes shimmered with a clarity that stole his words. This, she said, her mental voice a whisper, intimate and sure. This is what comes after, if you'll have it. He grinned, rough and real, brushing a thumb along her cheek. Think I'm already in too deep to say no, he said, feeling her laughter ripple through him like sunlight breaking clouds. The console beeped, pulling them back to the present, a proximity alert, faint but growing. Dom reluctantly stepped away, checking the readings. Looks like company, he said, his tone sharpening as he scanned the sensors. A small craft, unmarked, trailing them at the edge of hyperspace range. Drelock, Lysa asked, sliding into the co-pilot's seat, her focus snapping into place beside his. Probably, he said, adjusting the shields. Mercer's not the type to let a loss slide. He glanced at her, catching the steel in her expression. Can you reach out? See who's there? She nodded, closing her eyes, and he felt a faint hum through their bond as her mind stretched outward. After a moment, she opened them, frowning. No clear thoughts, shielded, likely mechanical. Drones, perhaps. Her voice carried a chill. They're tracking us. Dom cursed, plotting a course adjustment. We'll lose them in the nebula cluster ahead. Mess with their sensors. He punched in the coordinates, the ship banking slightly as hyperspace shifted around them. Lysa's hand found his arm, a steadying touch. Together, she said, her mental tone firm, a partner's vow. He nodded, a flicker of pride swelling in him, not just for himself, but for her, for what they'd become. The nebula loomed, a swirling mass of crimson and violet gas, and the transport plunged in, screens flickering as interference scrambled the drone signal. Dom wove through the currents, hands steady on the controls, while Lysa monitored the readings, her presence a calm anchor in his mind. The pursuing craft vanished from the sensors, either lost or deterred, and he eased back, the tension draining as silence returned. That's the last of them, for now, he said, turning to her. She leaned against the seat, exhaustion creeping in, but her eyes held a quiet fire. You fly like you fight, she said, her voice teasing through their bond. Relentless. He smirked, reaching for her hand again. Got something worth fighting for. She rose, stepping into his space, and he pulled her down onto his lap, her weight settling against him like a missing piece. Her arms looped around his neck, and he kissed her again, slow, deep, a seal on the path they'd chosen. The bond hummed between them, a steady rhythm that drowned out the stars, and he felt her smile against his lips, a shared certainty blooming in the quiet. Two paths, one bond, he murmured, echoing her earlier words. She nodded, resting her forehead against his. To the relay, to justice, then wherever we go next. The ship sailed on, hyperspace, an endless canvas beyond, and Dom knew it. A capsule's fall had sparked this, humanity's fire meeting alien light, forging something unbreakable. As the nebula faded behind them, the future stretched wide, theirs to shape together.